What happens when Taylor Swift walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a conversation about music, success, and the extraordinary chapter of her life, and suddenly finds herself facing a line of questioning that becomes increasingly personal? That is the premise of the dramatic confrontation described in the source story we're examining today. And according to that account, what began as a seemingly friendly appearance quickly transformed into a tense exchange involving Taylor's fame, her public image, her presence at NFL games, her influence, her past decisions, and eventually her relationship with Travis Kelce. But there was one moment that reportedly changed the entire tone of the conversation. A question about whether Taylor Swift had somehow become too much, too visible, too successful, too present, and eventually, whether her enormous spotlight was somehow taking attention away from the man she was there to support. Taylor's response, as presented in the story, was not a scream. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a dramatic walkout. Instead, it was something much more controlled. She pushed back. And the further the conversation went, the more the story portrayed Taylor as refusing to apologize for simply taking up space in a world that has spent years scrutinizing almost everything she does. Before we get into the most intense moment of this story, if you're a Swiftie who wants to follow every major chapter, controversy, relationship development, and career milestone surrounding Taylor, you're watching Taylor Timeline. So subscribe, because this isn't just about one interview. It's about what happens when the world's most recognizable pop star is asked to defend the way she lives her life. And this is where the story begins. The studio lights were bright. The audience was energized. And the atmosphere, at least at first, was exactly what you'd expect from a major Taylor Swift television appearance. Applause. Smiles. Cameras. A familiar daytime TV setting. Taylor arrives, according to the account, looking composed and professional. And that's important. Because Taylor has spent much of her adult life learning how to walk into rooms where every facial expression can become a headline. A smile can become a story. A pause can become a theory. A sentence can become a viral clip. And a single question can turn into a national conversation. That level of attention is difficult for almost anyone to imagine. For Taylor, however, it has become part of the territory. The story describes the early portion of the interview as warm and comfortable. Questions about her career. Questions about the extraordinary year she had experienced. Questions about performing. Questions about songwriting. And for a while, everything appears normal. Taylor answers thoughtfully. She talks about gratitude. She reflects on the overwhelming scale of her career. And the audience responds warmly. It is exactly the kind of segment viewers might expect. Until Joy Behar enters the conversation from a different angle. According to the supplied account, Joy shifts toward Taylor's unprecedented visibility. Concerts. Red carpets. Football games. Public appearances. And suddenly, the question becomes whether Taylor's presence has reached a point where people might consider it excessive. That is where the atmosphere changes. Because, are you successful? Is one question. Are you becoming too visible? Is another. And Taylor's answer, as presented in the story, is revealing. She doesn't deny that she's everywhere. She doesn't pretend she isn't one of the most recognizable people on earth. Instead, she separates visibility from control. The argument is simple. Taylor can decide where she goes. She can decide what she works on. She can decide what she shares. But she cannot decide which camera operator points a lens at her. And that distinction becomes one of the central themes of the confrontation. Because this is something Taylor has dealt with for years. She can walk into a stadium. A camera finds her. She can leave a restaurant. A photographer follows her. She can attend an event. Within minutes, social media is discussing what she wore, who she spoke to, where she looked, and what her expression supposedly meant. The public sees the footage. But the person being filmed doesn't necessarily control the footage. And that distinction matters. The story then pushes the conversation toward Taylor's appearances at NFL games. And this is where the issue becomes even more complicated. Taylor isn't attending those games because she is an NFL analyst. She isn't pretending to understand every strategic decision on the field. She's there to support someone she cares about. But because Taylor Swift is Taylor Swift, an ordinary appearance in a football stadium doesn't remain ordinary. It becomes an event. The camera finds her. The crowd reacts. Social media explodes. News outlets publish screenshots. Sports shows discuss her. Entertainment programs discuss her. Fans discuss her. And suddenly, a person sitting in a luxury box or a stadium suite becomes part of the larger spectacle. The question presented in the source story is whether Taylor should somehow take responsibility for that attention. Her response, as described, is essentially this: she can choose to support someone. She cannot control what millions of people decide to do with that moment. And then comes the line that changes the energy. The story has Taylor pushing back against the idea that being visible means she should apologize for her success. That distinction is crucial, because there is a difference between confidence and arrogance. There is a difference between celebrity and self-promotion. And there is a difference between enjoying your success and believing you're entitled to everyone's attention. Taylor's position, as portrayed here, is not that everyone has to watch her. It's almost the opposite. If you don't care about her music, don't listen. If you don't care about her relationship, don't follow it. If you don't want to watch her at a football game, you don't have to. But the existence of criticism doesn't automatically mean the person being criticized has done something wrong. And that's where the conversation starts touching a much larger cultural question. Why are successful women so often asked to explain their visibility? Why does confidence sometimes become arrogance when it comes from a woman? Why can a man be celebrated for dominating a room while a woman is accused of taking up too much space? Those questions have existed long before Taylor Swift. But Taylor happens to be one of the biggest examples of what happens when those questions collide with modern celebrity culture. Her fame isn't ordinary. Her audience isn't ordinary. Her cultural influence isn't ordinary. And therefore, neither is the criticism. The story portrays joy as continuing to push. And Taylor continues to answer. Not explosively. Not recklessly. But with increasing firmness. Then comes another accusation. The suggestion that Taylor selectively uses her enormous platform. That she speaks when it is safe. That she chooses causes carefully. That she manages her image. And this is where the interview, according to the source, moves beyond celebrity gossip. It becomes a conversation about authenticity. Because here's the uncomfortable reality of being famous in the modern era. People want celebrities to speak. Until they speak about something controversial. Then some people want them to stay quiet. People demand authenticity. Then criticize them for every imperfect decision. They want transparency. Then complain when a celebrity reveals too much. They want celebrities to use their platforms. Then accuse them of seeking attention when they do. Taylor's response in the source story centers on that contradiction. She doesn't claim to speak for everyone. She speaks from her own experience. And that distinction matters. Because Taylor has repeatedly evolved in public. The teenage songwriter who first entered the spotlight isn't the same person who eventually became one of the world's most influential artists. Her opinions changed. Her confidence changed. Her understanding of fame changed. Her willingness to speak publicly changed. And if someone has lived through decades of public scrutiny, isn't growth supposed to be part of the story? That becomes one of the strongest emotional turns in this account. Because eventually, the conversation reaches Taylor's earlier years. The years when she was much quieter. The years when she avoided certain political and cultural conversations. And instead of denying that history, the story presents Taylor as acknowledging it. She was afraid. That is the turning point. Not because fear is unusual, but because admitting fear in front of millions of people is very different from presenting yourself as fearless. The story describes Taylor explaining that she once believed staying quiet could protect her. That keeping opinions private could prevent backlash. That avoiding controversy could keep her career safe. And then she describes learning something different. Silence doesn't necessarily protect you. Sometimes, it isolates you. That idea gives the entire confrontation a deeper emotional layer. Because now we're no longer talking only about football games or celebrity visibility. We're talking about a woman who has spent years learning what her own voice means. And that is one of the most interesting parts of Taylor Swift's public evolution. She didn't begin her career as someone who seemed determined to become a cultural commentator. She began as a songwriter, a teenager with a guitar, a young artist writing about heartbreak, friendship, insecurity, growing up, and the strange experience of becoming famous. But fame changes people. Experience changes people. Success changes people. And perhaps most importantly, mistakes change people. The Taylor of one era can disagree with the Taylor of another era. And that's not necessarily hypocrisy. Sometimes it's growth. The story then presents another unexpected question. Is Taylor Swift a role model? And her answer is reportedly much more complicated than simply saying yes. She doesn't claim perfection. She doesn't say people should copy her life. Instead, the response emphasizes humanity, mistakes, learning, growth, integrity. And that may actually be more compelling than claiming to have all the answers. Because Taylor's entire career has been built around documenting change. Different eras, different sounds, different relationships, different versions of herself. The girl who wrote one kind of song at 17 is not supposed to think exactly the same way at 30. The artist who once feared saying too much may eventually decide that silence costs more than speaking. And the woman who once worried about being liked may eventually become more interested in being understood. That distinction becomes one of the emotional centers of the story. Being liked is not the same as being understood. And for someone as famous as Taylor Swift, that may be one of the hardest lessons of all. Because millions of people think they know her. They know the songs. They know the outfits. They know the public relationships. They know the headlines. They know the Easter eggs. They know the interviews. But no audience, no matter how devoted, can know every private decision a person makes. And that's where Taylor's argument becomes especially powerful. You see the spotlight. You don't necessarily see the shadows. You see the stadium. You don't see what happened before she walked inside. You see the smile. You don't see the decision behind it. You see the headline. You don't see everything that was left unsaid. That doesn't mean celebrities should never be criticized. Of course they should. Taylor herself has acknowledged that public figures can make mistakes. But criticism becomes something different when it assumes motives without evidence. And that is exactly what the story portrays Taylor objecting to. Not criticism. Not disagreement. But the assumption that someone else's interpretation of her life is automatically the truth. And then the interview takes another dramatic turn. Because Joy brings Travis Kelce into the conversation. And suddenly, the entire dynamic changes. The question is no longer simply about Taylor's career. It's about her relationship. And more specifically, whether her visibility has somehow overshadowed Travis's. That question hits differently. Because Travis Kelce had already established himself as a major NFL star long before his relationship with Taylor became a cultural phenomenon. His career didn't begin when Taylor entered the picture. His accomplishments didn't suddenly appear because cameras began showing her in the stands. And according to the source story, Taylor makes that point forcefully. She refuses to frame her relationship as a competition. She refuses to accept the idea that supporting Travis somehow diminishes him. And that leads directly into the most explosive portion of the entire story. Because Taylor's answer isn't just a defense of Travis. It's also a statement about partnership. Two successful people can exist beside one another without one person's success canceling out the others. A woman can cheer for a man without making him smaller. A man can support a woman without making her smaller. Love doesn't have to be a scoreboard. And perhaps that's why this portion of the story would resonate so strongly with fans. Because underneath all the celebrity spectacle is something surprisingly ordinary. The desire to support someone you love. The desire to be supported in return. And the frustration that can come when outsiders turn that relationship into a competition. But just when it appears the conversation might finally calm down, the story reaches its biggest question yet. And Taylor's response is described as the moment the entire studio goes silent. Because Joy asks whether Taylor believes her own enormous influence has become excessive. And when Taylor answers, the confrontation reaches a completely different level. The question isn't merely about fame anymore. It's about power, influence, responsibility, and whether the person at the center of the world's biggest pop cultural machine has a responsibility to control what that machine does. Taylor's answer, as presented in the story, is that influence is something people choose to give. That doesn't mean she ignores the responsibility. Quite the opposite. It means she recognizes it. And that distinction sets up the next stage of the confrontation. Because if Taylor understands the power she has, what does she believe she should do with it? And what does she believe she owes the people watching? That's where the story gets even deeper. And that's where part 2 begins. The studio is already tense. But now the questions are no longer simply about Taylor Swift's visibility. They're about the machinery behind it. Her public image. Her public statements. Her influence. Her relationship. And whether the person millions of people see on stage is actually the person making the decisions behind the scenes. The source account describes Joy challenging Taylor on the idea that everything she does is carefully calculated. And that accusation touches one of the oldest debates surrounding celebrity culture. Can someone be both strategic and genuine? Because here's the thing, of course Taylor has a team. Of course she has publicists. Of course major appearances are planned. Of course a career at this level requires coordination. But does planning automatically mean everything is fake? That's the leap the story portrays Taylor rejecting. Every major public figure makes choices about what to share. News anchors do it. Politicians do it. Actors do it. Talk show hosts do it. Musicians do it. Even ordinary people do it on social media. We choose the photo. We choose the caption. We choose the moment. We choose what stays private. That doesn't necessarily mean the person behind the decision is artificial. And Taylor's argument, according to the account, is essentially that there is a difference between curating communication and manipulating people. That distinction is incredibly important. Because Taylor Swift's public image is one of the most analyzed images in modern entertainment. Every era comes with a visual identity. Every album has a story. Every appearance can be dissected. Every lyric can be connected to another moment. And fans have become incredibly skilled at reading those details. Sometimes that attention is exactly what makes Taylor's relationship with her audience so powerful. But it also creates a strange paradox. The more carefully fans study Taylor, the more difficult it becomes for Taylor to simply exist without interpretation. A glance becomes a clue. A color becomes an Easter egg. A lyric becomes evidence. A vacation becomes a theory. A football game becomes a headline. A silence becomes suspicious. And eventually, you have a person who cannot simply be quiet. Because even silence gets interpreted. That is the environment Taylor has lived inside for years. So when someone says everything she does is calculated, the question becomes, calculated by whom? And calculated for what? Is every decision part of a master plan? Or is a highly experienced artist simply very aware of the consequences of being seen? Those are not the same thing. And this is where the story portrays Taylor becoming more direct. She refuses to accept the idea that her popularity proves her audience has been manipulated. Millions of people don't attend a concert because they're required to. They don't memorize lyrics because a publicist instructed them to. They don't spend hours discussing albums because a marketing department ordered them to. Something has to resonate. Something has to connect. And that connection is one of the most fascinating aspects of Taylor Swift's career. She has built an audience that doesn't simply consume her music. Her fans participate in it. They analyze it. They discuss it. They interpret it. They build communities around it. And that is part of why Taylor's cultural influence has become so difficult to separate from the music itself. But influence brings another question. Responsibility. If one person can reach millions, should that person be expected to use that power carefully? The story's answer appears to be yes. And Taylor's position is not that she should be exempt from criticism because she is famous. It's that criticism should be based on what she actually does, rather than assumptions about why she does it. That is a subtle difference. But in the world of celebrity news, subtle differences rarely survive. The internet likes certainty. It likes heroes. It likes villains. It likes winners. It likes losers. And most importantly, it likes clips. A 30-second exchange can erase an hour-long conversation. A single sentence can become a headline, and a headline can become a narrative. That's why moments like the one described in this story become so powerful. Whether every detail of the account is independently verified or not, the underlying scenario taps into something audiences understand immediately. Taylor Swift is one of the few celebrities whose every public appearance can become an event. And when someone challenges her directly, people want to know what happens next. But there is another layer. Taylor's relationship with criticism has changed over time. Early in her career, criticism was often intensely personal. Her songwriting was questioned. Her dating life was scrutinized. Her image was dissected. Her friendships became headlines. Her mistakes became cultural moments. And through all of it, she kept writing. That may be one of the most important details in understanding Taylor's career. When something happened, she often turned toward the work. A difficult period could become a song. A public misunderstanding could become an album. A personal transformation could become an entire era. And eventually, the criticism itself became part of the artistic conversation. That's why the idea of Taylor suddenly being unable to handle criticism doesn't really fit the larger arc of her career. She has been criticized for years. What has changed is how she responds. There is a difference between hearing criticism and accepting someone else's version of you. Taylor can listen. She can disagree. She can learn. She can change. But she doesn't have to surrender her identity simply because someone else demands it. And that is exactly where the story's confrontation becomes emotionally interesting. Because Taylor isn't portrayed as trying to win. She's trying to define her own boundaries. There's a difference. Winning a television argument means making the other person look foolish. Setting a boundary means making your own position clear. And according to the story, Taylor repeatedly chooses the second option. Even when the audience applauds, she doesn't appear to feed off the reaction. Even when joy challenges her, Taylor doesn't simply insult her. Even when the room turns against the host, Taylor doesn't celebrate. Instead, she keeps returning to the same idea: judge what I actually do. Not what you assume. Not what you imagine. Not what fits a convenient narrative. What I actually do. That philosophy also explains why the Travis Kelce portion matters so much. Because Taylor could easily have turned the conversation into a defense of herself. Instead, according to the source account, she redirects attention toward Travis. She makes the point that his accomplishments belong to him. His football career belongs to him. His success does not depend on her. And her support doesn't diminish him. That may be one of the most important relationship details in the entire story. Because celebrity relationships are often framed as competitions. Who is more famous? Who earns more? Who has more followers? Who benefits more? Who is helping whose career? But real relationships don't necessarily operate like that. A relationship isn't a business merger. It's not a ranking. It's not a chart. And according to the story, Taylor refuses to accept the premise that supporting her partner somehow makes him less accomplished. That is where the interview's larger conversation about women becomes relevant. Because Taylor's response suggests that society can sometimes treat a successful woman's visibility as a threat to the people around her. If she's quiet, she's calculated. If she's outspoken, she's too political. If she's confident, she's arrogant. If she supports her partner, she's overshadowing him. If she stays private, she's hiding something. If she shares something personal, she's seeking attention. The expectations can become impossible. And that impossible standard may be what Taylor is really pushing against. Not criticism. Not accountability. But the demand that she constantly shrink herself to make other people comfortable. That is a powerful theme. And it reaches beyond Taylor Swift. It reaches into the broader conversation about women in entertainment, sports, business, politics, and culture. How much success is acceptable? How visible is too visible? When does confidence become arrogance? And who gets to decide? Those questions are precisely why Taylor's response, as portrayed in the story, resonates beyond the immediate interview. Because Taylor Swift isn't the first woman to hear that she's too much. But she may be one of the most visible women ever to answer that accusation on such a massive stage. And then comes another emotional turn. The question of whether Taylor considers herself a role model. At first, the answer seems surprising.
No.
But listen to what that means. She isn't saying she doesn't understand the influence she has. She's saying she doesn't want to pretend she's perfect. That's an important distinction. A role model is often imagined as someone who has everything figured out. Taylor's story is much more complicated. She has made mistakes. She has changed. She has been criticized. She has apologized. She has defended herself. She has learned. And perhaps that is precisely why millions of people connect with her. Not because she is perfect, because she is visibly evolving. Every era has a different version of Taylor. And fans don't necessarily expect those versions to agree. They expect them to grow. That's what makes the idea of a Taylor timeline so compelling in the first place. You're not watching one static celebrity. You're watching decades of evolution. And when you look at the entire timeline, the confrontation described in this story becomes another potential chapter in that evolution. A chapter about boundaries. A chapter about confidence. A chapter about partnership. And a chapter about refusing to apologize for success. But there is still one question hanging over the entire exchange. What happens when a celebrity decides that she doesn't want to be endlessly agreeable anymore? Because for years, the public often rewards celebrities who are charming, gracious, diplomatic, and easy to interview. But the moment they become firm, the reaction can change. Suddenly they're difficult. Suddenly they're cold. Suddenly they're arrogant. Suddenly they're too much. And that brings us to the most revealing part of this entire story. Taylor's refusal to confuse kindness with surrender. She can be polite without agreeing. She can be gracious without backing down. She can respect another person while challenging what they said. And perhaps most importantly, she can leave the conversation without allowing someone else to define what happened. That is the image the source story ultimately presents. Not Taylor Swift as an untouchable superstar. Not Taylor Swift as a victim. Not Taylor Swift as a perfect role model. But Taylor Swift as someone who has spent years learning how to stand inside the spotlight without allowing the spotlight to completely control her. And that brings us to the question that changed everything. The question about Travis. The question about whether Taylor's fame has somehow become larger than his. Because that's where the conversation stops being about media criticism and starts becoming about love, partnership, and the strange price of being one of the most famous couples in the world. There are certain questions that immediately change the temperature of a room. According to the source story, this was one of them. The conversation had already moved through Taylor's career, her influence, her public image, her political evolution, and the scrutiny surrounding her. But now the subject was Travis Kelce. And the question wasn't simply about their relationship. It was about whether Taylor's fame was somehow diminishing his. That is a very different accusation. Because Travis was already an established professional athlete. His career existed independently of Taylor. His accomplishments existed independently of Taylor. His reputation existed independently of Taylor. And the idea that Taylor's presence could somehow erase all of that creates an interesting contradiction. Taylor's fame can certainly change the amount of attention surrounding Travis. That's obvious. But increased attention is not the same as diminished achievement. In fact, the relationship has created an unusual intersection between two enormous audiences. Football fans who may not have followed Taylor's career before. Swifties who may not have followed the NFL closely. Entertainment viewers. Sports viewers. Pop culture audiences. And suddenly, two worlds that previously existed separately were watching the same story. That crossover is part of what made the relationship such a phenomenon. But it also created an endless cycle of commentary. Every appearance could become news. Every game could become a celebrity event. Every interaction could become a social media conversation.